Good evening, everyone. Oh, it got real quiet. Thank you. Good evening and welcome. My name is Jessica Lasky. I'm the program manager of Arts and Letters Live at the Dallas Museum of Art. Welcome to our new and notable event with Casey Gerald. The event is co-sponsored by the William P. Clement Center for Southwest Studies at Southern Methodist University, or SMU. It's wonderful to look out and see such an enthusiastic, sold-out crowd, so thank you for being here. Yeah. A few logistics to note before we start. Please take a moment to silence and put away your cell phones. At the end of Casey's presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask him questions. So simply raise your hand and a staff member will find you. I will be one of those staff members with a wireless microphone, and we'll hand it to you. And if possible, if you can stand while you ask your question so that Casey can actually see you and address you directly, that would be great. Then afterwards, we invite you to meet Casey at the book signing in the concourse near the DMA store, right where you walked by to come in, where copies of There Will Be No Miracles Here will be available for purchase, and Casey will be signing. I'd like to thank and acknowledge Arts and Letters Live's season supporters, the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts, and the McGee Foundation Arts and Letters Live Endowment Fund at the DMA. Major support is provided by the Hirsch Foundation. The Fairmont Hotel Dallas is the exclusive hotel partner for the 2019 Arts and Letters Live series, and promotional support is provided by KERA. Special thanks tonight to SMU and the Arts and Letters Live staff and volunteers. I hope you'll join us again very soon for many more Arts and Letters Live events that we have coming up. For example, on October 14th, we will welcome Ben Mosier, who's the author of a landmark new biography of Susan Sontag. It draws from the writer's restricted archives and interviews with those who have remained silent on her until now, which includes Annie Leibovitz. Then, then on October 16th, join us to hear memoirist and travel writer Pico Iyer's musings on his two recent books, Autumn Light, A Season of Fire and Farewells, a moving meditation on impermanence and grief, and A Beginner's Guide to Japan. And you can come a little bit early before the event and enjoy a tour of Japanese art that we have in the DMA collection. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Graybill, who is our introducer for tonight's event. He serves as professor in the Department of History at SMU, where he also directs the William P. Clement Center for Southwest Studies. And he is the author and/or editor of 4 books, including The Red and the White, a family saga of the American West. He's currently working on several projects, including a biography of the legendary Texas cattleman, Charles Goodnight. Arts and Letters Live has been delighted to collaborate with Andy on this event and several others in recent years, and we're delighted that so many faculty and students from SMU are in the audience tonight. Thank you for joining us. Now please help me give a very warm welcome to Andy Graybill.
Good evening. Let me start by thanking a few folks of my own who have worked with us at SMU's Clement Center for Southwest Studies to bring Casey Gerald to Dallas this evening, beginning with our good pals here at the DMA. I love working with them. Arts and Letters Live is just a real gem and a treasure. I'm sure you'll all agree. Let me thank Ruth Ann Elmore, the Clement Center, and Maria Schappa in SMU's Ware Residential Commons for their support for some of the things we're doing on campus tomorrow. We are also grateful for the support of our good friends at the SMU Library, especially Amy Carver and Cindy Rupi, and Holly Jeffcoat, who is Dean of the SMU Libraries. And a big hug to Associate Provost Sherry Kunovich, as well as Matt Robinson, who's the director of SMU's Rotunda Scholars Program. And let me extend a special welcome to the Rotunda Scholars who are here with us tonight. Delighted that this has all come together. So when I first saw mention of Casey Gerald's book last fall, I thought, here's someone we have to bring to Dallas. In due time, I read his extraordinary memoir, and I got in touch with Carolyn Bess and Michelle Witcher here at the DMA to pitch the idea together to Casey and to his publisher. Things came along, got together. Before long, we had early October 2019 on the calendar, and here we are, on the very day that Casey's book has appeared in paperback. There are copies for sale outside. And I hope that now that it's in paperback form, it's going to find its way into even more hands and homes across the country and beyond. All that having been said, I believe in truth in advertising. So what I had not done, however, was actually watch the 2016 TED Talk that vaulted Casey into the national conversation about some of the most complex and important issues of our time: race, faith, sex and masculinity, economic inequality, how we define success, especially in a supposedly meritocratic society, and maybe above all, the struggle to be and to remain human in an often inhuman world. So in promoting this event, as well as a couple that we're going to host tomorrow at SMU, I shamelessly sent out links to this TED Talk that I had not yet watched, titled, quote, "The Gospel of Doubt." But I felt so pressed for time that I couldn't carve out the 18 minutes to actually sit down and watch it myself. I should say here as an aside that attending academic meetings is really important. I'm glad that got a laugh, which is exactly what it deserves, because they're not important. But at any rate, I found myself preoccupied. Recently, I did watch it. And as my wife, who's here tonight, can attest, it reduced me briefly to a sloppy mess. For reasons I don't think I can even really properly articulate now, but it really got inside of me. And I've viewed it at least a half a dozen times since and gotten something different on each occasion, which I think is testament to just how rich those 18 minutes are. Invariably, I find it humbling and edifying. So as such, I'm delighted to introduce him to you this evening, which, given that many of you have probably already read the book, might seem just a little presumptuous since he's already told you a lot about himself between the covers of his memoir. So I'll just hit a few highlights. Casey was raised in Dallas and graduated from South Oak Cliff High School. I believe that one of his teachers is even here in the audience this evening, along with members of his family and his extended friend network. He then enrolled at Yale, where he majored in political science, founded the Yale Black Men's Union, and even won an Ivy League championship as a cornerback for the Bulldogs. He went on to study at Harvard Business School, where with some classmates, he established MBAs across America, which works with entrepreneurs nationwide to help tackle some of our most pressing social problems. His book, There Will Be No Miracles Here, was published last year to rave reviews and ended up on any number of best of or top 10 of the year lists. But one of the best reviews that I found was one from NPR, whose writer explained that, quote, "It's a stunningly original literary memoir from a young man who's just as good a writer as he is an entrepreneur." As his TED Talk shows, he's also an extraordinary orator, and you'll soon hear that for yourselves. So please join me in welcoming Casey Gerald.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you all. I'm thinking a lot today about Jessie Norman, Miss Jessie Norman, who we just lost in one form yesterday. And Miss Toni Morrison, who we also lost in one form not long ago. And I have to think, especially since I was so nervous this morning, about my grandmother who transitioned last summer. And some years ago, I was giving a talk in Boston, and I woke up and I was just losing it. I mean, I was just a nervous wreck. And couldn't remember my speech, couldn't stop crying, all this kind of stuff. And then I got a phone call that informed me that Maya Angelou had died. And I said, oh God, it's gonna be so bad. Maya didn't even want to be alive to see this thing. And so I was really losing my shit. And I said, oh, let me call Granny. And I called her. And my grandmother, she was kind of a prayer fascist. I mean, if you kind of dropped a pen on the floor, she'd pray over it. And so I said, oh, Granny, I'm having a hard time. I need you to pray for me real quick. And she prayed this prayer that changed my life. She said, God, will you help Casey remove self so that whatever it is you have to say to people, they can receive it? Because there are a lot of cultures, but there's only one humankind, and all of them can hear you if he gets out of the way. And I think of that prayer all the time, And I think of my grandmother all the time, and so I'm so grateful that my remaining grandmother is here tonight. I think she's here. That's her. There she is. Okay. Hey. Hey, Gran. Without whom none of this would be possible. If you had told 14-year-old me that, or 15 or 19 or 29, I'm 32, or 31-year-old me, that I would be here in Dallas discussing a book that I wrote about myself, he probably would have wept, actually. He definitely would not have believed it, not only because of the obvious reasons, but also I had not planned to be a writer. And in fact, I didn't even really read in earnest, not that I couldn't read, but I did not read until I was nearly 23 years old, actually. But there's one book that I did read as a child, first grade, I think, that left its mark. And it's a book perhaps you've read also. It's called The Boxcar Children. Now, in recent, a lot of Boxcar Children fans, these are all college students. They're freshmen, and y'all haven't read anything before 2010. So, but I'm glad you're here anyway. That's great. Anyway, there's this one scene from The Boxcar Children that I still consider to be a high watermark of American letters. For the first time in many days, there's butter for dinner. And Jessie, who was one of the younger sisters, she cries, "Oh, butter." She's very excited. But Benny, who was the youngest at 6, he's old enough to spread his own butter, but all they have is a spoon. And at some point in his life, Benny's been taught that you need a knife to spread butter, and so without one, he's worried that he can't spread a thing. So he's freaking out. And Henry, the oldest, at 14, and the man of the non-house, he comes to the rescue and he says, "Benny, this is a magic spoon. Turn it around and use the handle, and it's a knife." And Benny's life was changed. And mine was too. When I read that, I held it dear because it taught me that sometimes it doesn't matter what you have. All that matters is what you're trying to do. And I saw myself in Benny, and I had, thank God, a Henry of my own and my older sister, Tasha. When our parents could not agree on what to name me, they turned to Tasha, who was 4 at the time, and she offered, "Call him Casey." My understanding is that she got this name from a soap opera character. Dr. Casey, a woman. I don't know what she was trying to say with that. But this arrangement held. My parents disagreed. My sister broke the tie. I almost got my ass kicked. My sister fought for me. I couldn't find the right keys. My sister changed her notes so we could sing in harmony. And for a time, as teenagers, we actually lived a bit like Boxcar Children. When I needed her most, my sister, who was a valedictorian at South Oak Cliff High School and had gone off to school in Louisiana, she got word that I'd resorted to sleeping on various floors and running barefoot through the streets with my friends and subsisting on a diet of zebra cakes and Fanta soda with my cousin who was here, I think, also. And she decided to drop out of college and come back to Texas to take care of me, which is not exactly what I wanted. There I was anyhow, a captured ward of my 19-year-old sibling in a Section 8 two-bedroom that she'd somehow wrangled. There we were together, not exactly orphans, yet not too far off, and awful, and not too sad about it either way. The first thing I remember of our life together is Christmas. We had never had, that I remember, a real Christmas tree before, but we were making a home now, and on television, people with homes made their Christmas have real Christmas trees. So without asking anybody for money or permission, Tasha and I drove to the Christmas tree lot and bought a Christmas tree. That was pretty easy. And then around March, we finally took down that beautiful tree which, uh, which by then was turning brown and shedding pine needles that bloodied our feet, and we decided we would never have a real Christmas tree in our home again. We also decided to end the rationing of precious commodities like sugar. All our lives, we'd been told how much sugar we could use, hardly any really, ever. But now we bought big bags of Domino sugar, and I would pour and pour that fine white sugar until I decided the Kool-Aid was sweet enough. And all my sister said was, "Ooh, boy, that's sweet." Never, never you used up all my sugar. It was our sugar now, and we could get more. Uh, and the air conditioning, I write about this in my book, you can read. And the air conditioner, y'all know down here is so hot all the time. And sometimes my granny, who is a saint, I promise, but she'd keep the thermostat at almost 80, or at least it felt that way. Or she'd leave the air off in the car talking about gas was high when it was only 99 cents a gallon back then. No more, no more. Tasha and I ran our air conditioner so much and so cold that the pipes froze and spewed ice all over the carpet. And the maintenance man had to come fix it twice, but we laughed and laughed and turned the air back up and agreed that we would never be hot unless we wanted to. I mean it when I say we were not awful sad about our situation. In fact, I'm not sure that ever in the history of America, two teenage, almost orphans had more fun making home up from scratch than my sister and I did. But then, one day, a man from Yale showed up at my high school, South Oak Cliff High, to recruit me for Yale's football team. And this felt as out of the blue to me then as it may feel to you now. But the Yale man said, everybody said, really, that this was the best opportunity for me. The best thing for the whole community. Take this ticket, boy, they told me. I was not so sure. Yale seemed another world entire, a cold and foreign and hostile place. On the first day of my recruiting visit, I texted my sister an excuse for not going. "These people are so weird, Tosh." She replied, "You'll fit right in." And that was the only conversation I had about my college decision, which may be why it took so many years to understand what sent me on that journey way back when. You see, every journey is really two journeys, a going to and a going away. You need both impulses or else you're in trouble. If all you've got is a going away, you might end up lost, since the only thing on your mind is running. And if all you've got is a going to, you might end up sad because what you find is rarely as good as you thought it would be. So it helps to remember how awful the thing was that you left. It's a simple equation, really. And the stranger the journey, the better the math works. Just plug in what you were trying to get to and multiply it by what you were trying to get away from, and you'll understand a hell of a lot more precisely why you did what you did. At least this works for me. So I realized as I wrote this book just how mighty a going away I had in mind when I left Oak Cliff for New Haven. I'd paid my dues on the outskirts of the world, had worn the too little pants and the rundown shoes, had pretended not to hear the no you take hims and the he's not my responsibilities, had been a nobody for so long that I could still taste other people's leftovers, could still see the empty seats in stadium stands, could still feel a violent smirk come across my face when I sensed somebody sniffing around my life to figure whether I was worth their time. Maybe I had not been worth it for 18 years, but now I would be. I would flee off to Yale and forget my troubles and take on new troubles, nice troubles, like brokering peace in Israel or sending people into outer space or finding tax loopholes because I made too much money, which still has not happened. And boy, I worked so hard with those approximate goals in mind, chief goal of all to fit right in, that I made it quite a long ways from where I started, to Wall Street, to Washington, to Harvard Business School, covering somebody's magazine, to George Bush's dinner table even. I'll skip past the joke I could tell, though I do tell a juicy story about our rendezvous in the book. I will also skip past the details of my Horatio Alger story because that is exactly the narrative I hope my book and my life might counteract. I had achieved by my late 20s about everything a kid is supposed to achieve in this society. But I was real cracked up. Not exactly having a nervous breakdown, but not too far off. And I was awful sad either way. And what's worse, a lot of my friends were cracked up. And this was 2016, so the world was cracked up too. I had, it seemed, lived my way into a dead end, and so I set out with this book to trace those cracks. And before I finished, one of those friends, whose journey from St. Louis to Yale had also been a mighty going away, took his own life. A few months after he left this plane, he came to me in a dream. He was sitting in a booth in a diner. I stood across from him, leaning down to hear him over the noise. And he smirked, and he leaned his head back. And he said, "You know, Casey, we did a lot of things that we wouldn't advise anybody we loved to do." I knew exactly what he meant. The American dream, it turns out, is a tricky, dangerous thing. We're told again and again that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can do anything, be anybody, rise above your circumstances. But we fail too often to admit the limits, perhaps the emptiness of that promise, and we never calculate the price of that peculiar journey. Never take the time to notice that if you catch it from the right angle, a kid picking themselves up by their bootstraps can look just like a suicide. All the stuff we thought we ran from comes running after us. The selves we buried under all that fitting in come climbing out of shallow graves. We realize that we're stuck between the world we left and the world we strive to join. We realize that our silence holds these worlds together. We realize, or I realize now, that these worlds, this world that we inherited, in the words of Jose Munoz, is not enough. But I also must confess that though our world is not enough, it is, as far as I know, the only one we've got. So here we are, up Schitt's Creek together. My story aims to be the paddle that I made, I'm still making, to tell you the truth. It is hard to make a thing that's strong enough to get you where you need to go, but not impossible. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you have. All that matters is what you're trying to do. So I set out with my makeshift paddle to find the little boy I used to be, could have been, somewhere in the rubble. I had no search and rescue animals, no flashlights. All I had were words. Words became the breadcrumb trail that led me back to him. He took my hand, or I took his, and now we learn together how to live. That's why I'm here tonight, as a boy or a man who turned to words in search of life and put them down on paper to offer a shortcut to someone on the trail. The child who's been abandoned, the child who fears that who they are is not okay, the child who feels the pressure to be great, to be perfect, but who needs instead permission to be whole, to be free. I'll never forget the two books that found me on my own dark trail once I turned at last to reading. The first was On the Road, the second, Giovanni's Room. One line in that, sounds like we have a Giovanni's Room fan somewhere. One line in that latter book still means so much to me, I almost got it tattooed on my wrist before I left Los Angeles. One of many bad decisions I made in Los Angeles, which we'll get to. Baldwin writes, "People can't unhappily invent their mooring posts. Life gives these and also takes them away. And the great difficulty is to say yes to life." I have since learned that books cannot say yes for me, but I've also learned, perhaps you have as well, that they can say, as they have said to me so many times, "You're not alone." And if that's all they do, all they say, that's enough. For in so doing, books can shine a little light into our darkness. In so doing, books, I hope, can be our paddle home. Thank you. Let's imagine we're doing this like Tina used to do, Proud Mary. We're going to start nice and easy, and then we'll get real rough and cuss everybody out, and then we'll go home. It's easy to set a sort of point of what you want to do with the book, but as Mike Tyson used to say, everybody's got a strategy till you get punched in the mouth. And I started this exercise, and I got a couple chapters in, and I sent it to a great writer friend of mine. He's a great writer, friend of mine, to get his feedback. And he wrote back and he said, well, when can you hop on the line? Which is always a bad sign for those of you who have never gotten that email. And so we hopped on the line, and he says, say, man, what is this? You've been hired to write an autobiography. It's a straightforward exercise. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. It's grounded in the facts of your life. And there's a great tradition of autobiography in this country, led by people on the margins of society who write to assert that they exist. You should go read Frederick Douglass. Go read Maya Angelou. Learn from them, because you're going in the wrong direction. I was so glad for my friend's intervention because, first of all, I didn't send him any more pages of my book. Those of you who've known me for a long time know I hold grudges better than anybody. And, but it also clarified that I had no interest in writing that kind of book. I didn't need to write a book to know that I existed. And even though I had grown up and lived grown, the person that I was, I hadn't lived on the margins of anything. I thought at that time, and still think, about what Kendrick Lamar, Pulitzer Prize winner Kendrick Lamar, by the way, says on Section 80, his mixtape. He says, I'm not on the outside looking in. I'm not on the inside looking out. I'm in the dead center looking around. That was the perspective from which I wanted to write. I thought of what Louis Armstrong did to Stardust. Does anybody know the song Stardust? Great jazz. And for years and years, Stardust was this jazz standard. It sounded like hospital music to me. But everybody loved it. And then Louis Armstrong gets hold of it. This guy who's grown up in orphanages and whorehouses down in New Orleans, and he gets it. And he blows it wide open. And you listen to this thing, and once you've heard Louis Armstrong do Stardust, who in the hell wants to go back to the old way? Yeah? I thought it was my job to do that with the genre of memoir, and I had the skills to do it because I hadn't read any memoirs, so I could just make it up, which was great, actually. So how to do that then in practice? My grandfather was a preacher, and actually one of the folks here who works at the museum, Deetra, I don't know if she's in the room, was a member at our church, which was just so fantastic. And a preacher's got a very hard job. He preached from the time he was 16 to the time he was 70, which is when he died. And he was the first genius, perhaps the only genius I've known. But a preacher has a very hard job. They've got to tell a 2,000-year-old story over and over again and keep people from walking out on it. That's a hellacious challenge, you see. And I took so much of the sort of mission statement of this thing from that because I saw my job as taking the narratives and the stories that we've got and just kind of turning them over and seeing what hadn't been said about them, seeing what's under the rock of certain narratives that seem stable. And one of the biggest things on that was about the American dream. And one of the best pieces in the book, I read very quickly, happened here in Dallas, actually, in meeting George Bush at his presidential library in 2015. And I tell this story for a few reasons that'll become clearer. But one is to kind of drive home this point around what role stories like mine have served in the advancement of this myth of the American dream. And it says, I'm talking not about the foolishness you hear from politicians. If you work hard and play by the rules, you can do anything, be anybody. I'm talking about the real American dream, the way the country actually works. If you know the right people, they can help you do anything, be anybody. Rules and hard work be damned. They do have to like you, and that takes a good deal of work. This dream, of course, cannot be extended to 300 million people and therefore cannot be confessed to any. So despite the fact that America is designed from rooter to tutor for most of its citizens, especially those in places like Oak Cliff, to have nothing and achieve nothing, the political version of the American dream is essential. Kids like me are essential. Something and or someone has to keep the steam down. Perhaps that's why this crazy thing happened that I wasn't going to tell you about, since I think I've made my point. But it's one of those stories that will make you want to die all over again if you die without telling, so I'll just tell it real quick. One summer evening, not too long ago, as I stood near the end of a long buffet line in Dallas, I felt a hand rest on my shoulder. I rarely like to be touched without notice, so I just stood there a second or two, hoping it might be a phantom sensation. Before I glanced back, I saw then that the hand belonged to George W. Bush. For some reason, the 43rd President of the United States had to stand in line for dinner just like normal people. And also like normal people, but unlike me, he did not want to loiter there fondling lint in his pocket and pretending to appreciate the art on the walls, which was his. The president wanted to talk. Fine. So we talked as we moved along the line and put a few rolls and potatoes and, if I remember correctly, a slice of salmon apiece on our plates. The Secret Service or somebody took the president's plate once it was full. They did not take mine. So I held it between myself and the president, who squared up with me before we went to our seats. "Let me ask you something," he said, scrunched his mouth. "Was your dad around?" This felt as out of the blue to me then as it may feel to you now. For 6 or 7 minutes, the president and I had run a pretty good gamut of gab. Talked about his paintings and his school days and his brother Jeb, who was at that time campaigning poorly to be the 45th president. Yet after all that, Mr. Bush needed to know, or wanted to know, I'm trying not to speculate, whether I had grown up with a father. And since I had mastered the art of giving people exactly what I thought they wanted, which got me into a lot of trouble, not all of it bad, I replied, without even thinking much, "No, sir. Both of my parents were gone by the time I was 12, which, as we know, was not quite true, but not entirely untrue either." I don't remember what he said right after that, but I do know, because there's video evidence, that 2 years passed and I remained on the president's mind. He was sitting on a stage in Beverly Hills being interviewed by a gentleman who had also been famous for a long time, first for his success in finance, then for the felonies, which had in part made the success possible, and finally, as is the American way, for his good deeds. The man wanted to hear about the president's latest good deed, a program that he and the 42nd president had launched around the time we met, and Mr. Bush seized the opportunity to share with the check this out flick of his hand, a case study. So I'm sitting next to a young African-American kid, so I said, "What do you do, man?" He said, he skips ahead. I said, "Where you from?" He said, "Dallas." "Where?" "South Oak Cliff." The president lowers his voice as he tells this part. "South Oak Cliffs, you know, on the other side of the Trinity River." Then resumes. I said, "Wow, did you go to college?" He said, "Yeah, I went to Yale." He does an all shucks shrug, voice low again. "That's where I happen to go." Then he looks down and continues. And I said, "Interesting, you know, you must have parents who drove you." And he looks up and out into the audience. He said, "Not at all. My dad died early. My mother's in prison. But I had an aunt that focused me. Plus, I was a pretty good football player." Shrugs again and smirks. I said, "I didn't know y'all cared about football." Then he smothers the laugh line. Anyway, so he goes to Harvard Business School and he applies to the program. Now, when I first heard the president's story, I thought, wow, that kid is impressive. Then I realized that the president was talking about me, so I felt a bit confused and a little dirty too. But I was not upset at all. Couldn't be. In our buffet line rendezvous, I had offered Mr. Bush a vague, compelling story. The kind of story I'd learned to tell at my lunches years before, though shorter and more to the heartbreaking point. And he, being the world-class politician that he is, took those raw material and fashioned an even more pointed and compelling version, so inaccurate that it became a new delicious story of its own. The kind of story a man needs if he's going to keep his subjects from despair or mass unrest, or most of all, from the truth about their society. I imagine that is one reason he became president, and I reckon it is also why so many people said nice things to me, like, "Casey, you are the embodiment of the American dream." But it took me many years to realize that instead of smiling and saying thank you, I should have wept. What was important about that, you don't have to clap, it's all right. I've been doing this for a year, so it's all good. We're good. I've been going to therapy for a year also, so my need for external validation has plummeted. Otherwise, I'd be lying on the floor. What was so important about that was, first of all, it's fantastic material, you have to say. So I appreciate it on that front. But also, that interaction, which was one of 3 interactions I had with the president, made this a different book in a way that is surprising. I've been hating George Bush since I was 14 years old. I remember, actually, I think Nick is here. Nick, are you here? Nick? Oh, there he is. Nick is my cousin. He's like my brother. And I'll never forget, I was living with him at the time, eating up all his food and everything. And when the Iraq War started, I remember we were in Nick's room watching the Shock and Awe campaign. You remember that? So I've been hating George Bush for a long time. And then the night that I met him at his presidential library, I had just sat and listened to him talk about something, and I was just apoplectic, how, whoop-de-woo, blah, blah, awesome. So anyway, I go up to the buffet portion, and I'm going around to my peers, talking cash money trash about this man. Can you believe he said yada, yada, whoop-de-woo, and about to eat his food. I mean, two-faced, you see. And then I feel this hand on my shoulder. And I turn around and it's him, and I say, I was raised right, so I wasn't going to be disrespectful. We talked in the line. It was quick. I thought it was over. We look at the little name tags. I'm at table 10. Mr. President, where are you going? I'm going to table 10. We wind up at the same table. Anyway, after the deal, he comes up. He says, hey, let me take you to lunch. I'm happy to have free meals, so I said, sure, I'll go to lunch, whatever. So we wound up meeting. Anyway, I say all that to say, by the time I had spent these interactions with this person I had been hating since I was 14 years old, and I was 29 at the time, I had to grapple with this uncomfortable fact that I kind of liked him. And I couldn't just go write about him as though he were Satan incarnate. Even if I wanted to, I said, man, I don't know. It's something about the guy. He's kind of charming, whatever, And I said, wow, if I give that much grace to somebody who I think is a war criminal, then how much more grace do I have to give to my mother and my father? And that changed the book. It changed my life in a great way. We'll talk about my mother in a minute. She's a big star. I know she's here. And but my father, it was I write in the book. What was so interesting about Mr. Bush's question is this sort of flat myth, as we know, about the absent black father. Well, we don't know it because it's a myth, but we've been told it. And it's interesting because my father and my relationship, for those of you who have read the book, is much more complicated than that, and he's a much more complicated person than that, of course. I write early on that I say a great man is an inconvenience as a father because every boy wants to be his own man until it happens. And it's hard to do that when everybody's calling you the son of somebody, which was the vast majority of my childhood. My father is still considered one of the greatest high school football players in the history of the state of Texas. Went on to be the second black quarterback at Ohio State and real legend. But when I was a child, he was a real pain in my ass being around, actually, because I was like, I envied those boys who had been told so often by so many that their daddies weren't shit. Because for all the things that I could and did and will say about mine, I could not say that he wasn't shit. He was the greatest man that I had ever known, and his father was the greatest man that he had ever known, and that was most likely the root of all the evil inside each of us. And so it was a very complicated thing. But then by the time I got to elementary school, the only story that I was told about my father was that he was a drug addict, that he was this kid that threw away his life. I was in the 6th grade and went to school one day, and my 5th grade teacher, Miss Davis, who I think is here, is Gwendolyn Davis here? No? Is she there? Well, Miss Vance is here. Miss Davis has her own priorities. Yeah. Oh, there she is. Okay. There she's in the back. All right. There she goes. My 5th grade teachers are here, y'all. So many teachers are here. Yeah. We'll get to people in a minute. But so she came up and she said, "Are you all right?" And I was terrified of my teachers at that time. So I said, "Sure. Yeah, I'm all right." And she handed me the Dallas Morning News. And on the front page of the Dallas Morning News, I'm a 12-year-old kid, was my father behind bars. And the headline said, "Once the pride of Texas, South Oak Cliff star saw his life sacked by drugs." That was the only story I got. And that was a pretty flat story. And it wasn't until I was much older, and even in part researching this book, when I found that it was a lot more happening than that. When he was a sophomore in college at Ohio State, in a game against Purdue, he broke his back. And he was a quarterback. And he was a running quarterback. And he broke his back, and he was out for 5 games, and Ohio State made it to the Orange Bowl, 1977. And Woody Hayes, who was a very legendary head coach, he came to me and said, "Roderick, we need you." And my father, this had been his whole identity. He wanted to play. So he said, "All right, I'll do it." So he gets ready for the game, and before the game starts, a guy comes and he says, "You want me to give you something that'll help you play like a champion today?" And he hands him an envelope, and inside the envelope is cocaine. And he had never done it before. He had the game of his life. He was Orange Bowl MVP. He never played another game without using, and then it spiraled from there. So here we have a narrative that's been hiding under the rock of a story. The truth that's been hiding under the rock of a story. And so it wasn't enough for me to just say, "Oh, this guy did bad stuff." It's a lot more complicated than that. He is someone who was also happened to. And it was so important for me to try to grapple with that, because when I was a sophomore at Yale, I broke my hand in a game against Princeton. And after that, my head coach came to me and said, "Case, we need you to play." And I would have done anything at 20 to play for the Ivy League championship against Harvard at Harvard Stadium. But it just so happened that our team doctor gave me legal drugs to numb the pain. If somebody had offered me cocaine, I mean, hell, I did worse things probably at 20. But You see what I'm saying? So much of, people say, oh, the book is complicated and it goes over and over. People are complicated. And I think the job of personal narrative is to try to tell the truth. Toni Morrison used to tell her students, don't write what you know because you don't know nothing. And a lot of people think that is a warning against personal narrative. I think it's an invitation. What if the thing that is most important to us is the thing we know the least about? And what would it look like to go and investigate that? So I had to investigate my father. And I also had to kind of shift the moral judgment of addiction. Okay? And I'll tell you what helped me on that, which was watching the movie Train Spotters. Has anybody seen Train Spotters? Has anybody seen that movie? Great, great, great movie. And early on, there's a great monologue. It starts the deal, and there are a group of heroin addicts in this town, and they're a sort of gang. And the main leader of the gang gives this monologue around why heroin is so great. And it had never really struck me that there might be some, positive rationale for people, doing heroin until I watched that movie, and I had to write it differently. And my entry point to that was someone who was a very important person in my life growing up and in my cousin's life, which was a man named Dean. And Dean grew up, I'll just tell you about Dean. His Dean was a great guy. I found out that my father had relapsed because one day I was talking to my cousin and lied and said that my father had come home and given me a PlayStation. And my cousin was on the phone and he laughs, and he had this really annoying laugh at that time. And he said, "Fool, Uncle Crow's next door." And that's all he had to say, because we knew what was next door, and Dean lived next door, okay? So, and we've named my cousin Luke just for legal reasons. He might be litigious these days. He had good enough sense to know that the only people who visited the house next door were dope fiends, unless they were relatives of Dean, the chief dope fiend of that residence, and a real decent guy, despite or even because of his hobbies. Dean must have been our parents' age, but he had more kindness and creativity than your average grown person, was more resourceful too. I remember a stretch of days when he carried a cardboard box through the neighborhood selling toiletries for $1 a piece. I'm sure he acquired those toothpastes and deodorants by honest means because he was decent, as I said, and never stole a thing from anybody that I know of, and I would have heard about it. Dean was also always there when you needed him, like the evening he taught me and Luke how to install Aunt Chandra's front door. Okay, gentlemen, y'all watch me now. I'm going to do what I got to do as soon as I figure out what I got to do. 20 years later, that advice still works, and that door still stands. I tell you about Dean because I haven't seen him in a while and feel better when I think about him, especially the time he showed up with his head shaved and basketballs tattooed on his scalp. Didn't even know Dean liked basketball. But I also mention Dean because I want the record to show that I don't give much of a shit that my father began sometime before my 10th birthday hanging with dope fiends. Nor am I up in arms that he acquired and consumed a controlled substance himself, heroin mostly, according to him and to any number of news outlets. I never witnessed it myself, and I'm trying to tell you things for which I have solid evidence, or at least more interesting things than the claim or fact that a man tried heroin once and soon after became addicted. My best bet is that heroin must be pretty incredible, must lead to enough ecstasy to make a man's veins and future seem a small price to pay. Besides, I was, through my 20s, addicted to Skittles, enough of which will have you broke and strung out and dead too. And while that may seem like comparing apples to oranges, so to speak, addiction is addiction. And it just so happens that we've built ourselves a nice society that places all the folks addicted to fame and money and complaining a little lower than the angels, and down below water bugs and Hugo Chavez, places men and women who get high every now and then or all the time. Not that I'm endorsing any of it. I'm just not going to be the one to jump all over the addicts we don't like, at least not for being addicts. Daddy could have enjoyed all the heroin in the world for all I cared. I just wanted him to show up for my 10th birthday party and to inform me of his visit to Dean so I wouldn't be caught up in a lie. And I wanted him to be more careful so I wouldn't have to snuff that fire out on his shirt when I found him asleep in the bins that night. And I wanted him to go back to the Ace pawn shop and retrieve my old Sega Genesis and my Gigapets and other items of mine, or at least give me a cut of the proceeds. And I wanted him to pick me up from school on time like he used to. That's all. It was very important also to tell this story from the perspective of children and what children actually care about. The sort of more, I live in New York now, and I find myself trying as best I can to spend more time with children. They're far more interesting and compelling than grown people, and their minds are so much more expansive. And they haven't just adopted off the shelf the moral standards of society, which often are somewhat arbitrary. They've got their own kind of moral universe. My niece is 14 and my little cousin who's 7 are here. And they teach me so much. And so I thought it was very important to do that. And in doing that, you start to untangle. You start to find more stuff under the rock of story. You start to find more truth under the rock of story. And one of the biggest things I had to do was find the truth under the rock of the story of my mother, who's here, who I would love us to clap for because she's incredible. You don't have to. We're not going to call. We don't have to make her stand up. That's fine. That's all right. Such a star. I tell people out on the road, I say my mother is like a mix of 1980s Whitney Houston and Blanche DuBois from Streetcar Named Desire. She was just like, out of sight, a big star. And I say all the time that she was strange, and she called me not too long. She said, it really bothers me when you say Mama's strange. I said, Mama, I don't say it as a bad thing. Thank God you're strange. Otherwise, I would have been normal. Could you imagine? And so before I wrote this book, I had believed and had known that my mother had disappeared from a hospital when I was 12. That's what I thought. And then one day I was writing and I found some old middle school homework of mine. And it had her signature on it, and it was from the time I was 13. And I was horrified. I said, what is this? And I did all this snooping background, tried halfway, asked my sister, whether she was still. Turns out my mother was around for a whole year after I thought she was gone. And this really worried me because my job was to remember. And I couldn't remember. And I thought, again, going back to the mission statement of this book, I thought at first, well, better send this money back because I don't even have good memories. And then I thought it would be more interesting to try to bring language to an absence of memory. You see so often that some of the worst things that happen to us are the things we remember least, actually. And in doing that work, the first drafts of chapters about my parents were very vulgar and very nasty. And my editor said, this can't be it. It's like, you got to give me something more than that. And I worked through it, and I got to this point, and I write this line that disturbs a great number of people. It says, if ever your mother asks you to choose between her death and disappearance, have her die always, though not immediately, of course. And people were very disturbed by that, but I said, I think it's very important to say the truth of the feeling as a starting point. People talk about why the Psalms are so beautiful. It's because it shows the full range of how the writers of the Psalms actually feel about God. One psalm may be, God, you have forsaken me, you ruthless scoundrel. And then a few verses later is my Redeemer, my Protector, etc., etc. That is, I thought, very true. But once I was able to let go and feel free enough to put on the page those negative feelings, then I could come to see my mother not as my employee, but as a human being. And when I did that, I realized that the worst thing that ever happened to me was the most important thing she ever did for herself. She found herself in a situation that wasn't working. And she said, fuck it, I'm out of here. And that's remarkable. The price that free women have to pay in this society. You're expected in this society, if you're a woman, if you're somebody, to take all this shit, grin, bear it, be strong, be tough, be silent, care for your children, these monsters, that you brought into the world, okay? And the punishment, I write in the book, again, turning the narrative on its side, I write about Lot's wife, who was held up throughout all the Bible as this cautionary tale. Here are these evil people. God decides they got to die. Lot and his wife are supposed to be saved. The angel says, don't look back. Lot's wife looks back and she's turned into a pillar of salt. And nobody even writes the woman's name down. And I said, wow, why did she look back? Nobody ever answered that. What if she looked back because those people were her friends? What if she looked back because she couldn't bear the thought of seeing people burn alive even for righteousness' sake? And when you look at it that way, you say, wow, we could really use people with the courage of Lot's wife. I felt we could really use people with the courage of my mother. And if I didn't have that example of somebody willing to pay an enormous price to reclaim their own personal freedom, a price that she will continue to pay, that is not easy, then something like what I just wrote in New York Magazine to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans who came here, The Black Art of Escape, that piece would not be possible if I didn't have the example of my mother. Because then I saw an entry point to another great example of a story that I first heard from another Dallasite, Jatavia Gary, who's an incredible artist who, if you have not heard of her, I think she just actually moved back to Dallas from New York. Her work is incredible. She's had a work in the Whitney a few years ago called An Ecstatic Experience. And it tells the story of Miss Fannie Moore, who was interviewed by the Federal Writers Project in 1937. They went around and talked to formerly enslaved people. And Miss Fannie Moore told the story of her mother. And one day, out on the plantation, Miss Fannie Moore's mother got happy. And she started singing and shouting and hooting and hollering. And old Master Jim, the head of the plantation, he came out and he said, what's all this going on in the field? You think I sent you out here to hoot and yell? No, sirree. I sent you out here to work. And you better work before I put this cowhide across your black back. Miss Fannie Moore says a smile came across her mother's face. And she turned to Master Jim and she said, the Lord has showed me the way. I ain't gonna grieve no more. No matter how you all done treat me and my children, the Lord has shown me the way, and someday we ain't never gonna be slaves no more. No, Master Jim took that bullwhip, started lashing Miss Fannie Moore's mother across her back. But she didn't say nothing. She just went on back to the field, singing and shouting, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. So, if what I'm trying to do here is to say that the way that we as young people are taught to live in this society, we're told that, hey, we'll give you the keys to the kingdom, we'll let you into SMU, we'll let you into Yale, we'll put you on stages. In return, you've got to leave pieces of yourself outside, and the bargain is worth it. If what I'm trying to say is that bargain is not worth it, if what I'm trying to say is we can say to that dean at Yale that I heard a few years ago tell a group of freshmen, hey, you may be a token, just be the best token you can be. If what I'm trying to say is that we can tell those people, no, thank you, then we need other models. And I think Miss Fannie Moore's mother is a great model. And I think my mother is a great model. And she called me last year, actually, my mother, not Miss Fannie Moore's mother, which would be very compelling. You know, I lived in Los Angeles for a time, so I talk to all kinds of crazy shaman people these days. So I'd be happy, thrilled, actually, to talk to Miss Fannie Moore's mother if she would have me. My mother called, and she was, she had gone to a facility for a few days, and she called, and I said, hey, Ma, how you doing? And she said, I'm doing much better. She said, but all my friends are leaving. I said, Mama, you just got there. How'd you get all these friends? I'm telling you, she's a big star. I said, how'd you get all these friends? And so she started naming the friends that had left. And she said, and then Diane came. And she said, I can't wait, Diane. She said, I can't wait to go back and be with my man. And my mother asked her, well, Diane, where do y'all live? And Diane said, we live under the bridge. And he's not going nowhere, and I'm not going nowhere. And I just can't wait to be with my man. And I said, wow, Mom, that is so romantic. But aside from that, and it is actually, but aside from that, it got to something else I was trying to do with this book, which was to show that even people that you think are destitute have joy. People are surprised that the book is funny. I said, first of all, Oscar Wilde said, if you're going to tell people the truth, make them laugh or else they'll kill you. Okay? And I like living. Two, it's the truth. And so I think about my friends. We're going to do two more reading passages, and then I'd love to talk to y'all. As you know, I was telling one of the students who's from Pleasant Grove who has been advised not to say she's from Pleasant Grove by people but I said, listen, you better tell people you're from Pleasant Grove because then people won't give you any shit. I was telling her that sometimes when I'm traveling around the country and people learn I'm from Oak Cliff, I get free things because they think, oh my, like how did this happen? But I could not have imagined growing up in a better place. Absolutely remarkable community of Black people who loved and respected themselves and each other, and who demanded, who never expected people to, never accepted any excuse for you not believing that your life had value. That meant a great deal. It never occurred to me growing up in Oak Cliff with the teachers that I have that maybe you'll meet, you know, who are here, Brenda Cox and Demaris Vance and Gwendolyn Day. With these people, it never occurred to me that I was inferior because I was Black or because anything else. It really never crossed my mind. It wasn't until I got to Yale that I discovered all these Black people who were very confused. And I said, oh, y'all should have, instead of being on the Martha's Vineyard, wherever in the hell they go, y'all should have lived in Oak Cliff. You would have had shit lodging, but you would have really loved yourself, and I think that's a fair trade. Anyway, so I wanted to write about my friends. And one of my best friends in high school was one of the leaders of the Beckley Sainer gang, which doesn't even sound real, but it was damn real, and which was marvelous for me because I couldn't fight, and so all of my friends were really fantastic, violent fighters, and so I was never bothered, and that was marvelous, and so I wanted to try to capture the kind of joy that we had, and try to understand also why he was so protective of me. And I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and a principal of a high school said, what do you think we need in schools, policy? And the only word that came to me was kindness. I think about my high school and how cruelly we were treated, actually. And I told somebody some months ago there were more drug-sniffing dogs sent into South Oak Cliff High School by the police than there were SAT tutors. And that'll tell you something. But the policy stuff, what really matters is kindness. And so this part is about that. Trying to understand why Juice, that was his nickname, protected me. Maybe he protected me because I helped him with his homework a few times, or because he liked the way I struck people with words, a bit like he struck them with hands, or because I was his biggest fan during track season, yelling his name from the stands because he was an incredible runner and even incredible show-off. He had his personal best 800-meter dash time cut into his hair. And never had any family there to cheer him on. But none of this would be enough to explain his care for me then, or why years later when I graduated from Harvard, it was Juice, not my father, who called and said through tears that he was proud of me. Man, I saw you on that video and said, golly, look at my little nigga Case J. The only way I start to understand it is by looking past the surface of the violence into the packs of brawling gangsters to see my friend and brother Juice, who was just like me in ways that we both recognized but could not articulate. We both knew he was smarter than he let on. We both knew that he never complained about the nights he and his older brother slept in the park, nowhere else to go. And we knew, or I know now, that beneath the mask of viciousness, Juice was just a little boy. We were all just little boys, you know. Somebody must have forgotten that, forgotten us. So we found each other. And even here, in this forgotten world, there was joy. The joy that comes from freedom, a teenage thirst for life outside the rules, beyond reach, without the illusion of security, at a time when many boys and girls across the land were learning that illusion was all security could be. When they saw those planes bring down the towers, when they watched the futile shock and awe, when they heard the lies passed off as evidence. I was lucky, I learned early. That year, I felt the joy of making life on my own terms in whatever way I could. Stayed at so many houses that I couldn't tell you where I slept most nights. Bathed only when I could no longer bear the stench. Drank from water hoses instead of faucets. Spent aimless hours, days with my friends who were often as free as I. We started to grow up, or at least get older. We shared what little we had of food and money. We made football fields in the street and devastating jokes in the barbershop. And out of the naked crust of lost boys, we made something like a family. I'd ask, I'd only ask, especially in this city at this time, that we learn to see children, even the worst of them, as children who need a little kindness, who need a good morning, who might need a snack. And I thought it was very important to, again, disrupt the singular, the sort of narrative of the singular kid that makes it out, whatever this means. Because I was a hell of a lot more supported by Juice at South Oak Cliff than I was by many people who ran Yale University. And that tells you something about the courage of children. I'll end, before we talk to each other, with the question of love. Marlon Riggs, through the great Black queer writer Joseph Beam, said years ago, Black men loving Black men is the revolutionary act. As you know, anybody loving anybody is a revolution or a miracle or a disaster. So So, all right. One of the one of the things I had no interest in doing was writing a kind of dissertation of what it means to be an oppressed gay person. And people ask, they say, "Oh, there's not a lot of coming out in the book." And I said, I had one rule with this book. Again, I didn't read growing up, and thank God I didn't, because it didn't become a social status thing. When I began to read, it was because I needed vital information, and just because I didn't read as a child does not mean I didn't get vital information. I think of the great albums that meant so much to me and actually shaped this book, Lauryn Hill's Unplugged album, which so many people in my family had to endure me listening to on repeat, D'Angelo's Voodoo. And actually, the first time you deal with this question of sexuality in the book is me writing through, I don't know if people read it, seeing D'Angelo's video for Untitled. And I thought that was very important for a few reasons. One, I thought it was just really funny to kind of shock the shit out of people. But aside from that, I had read a great book by Jose Munoz, Cruising Utopia, and it talked about the potential of art to illuminate possibilities of another world. And I thought it was very important when I think about that song or that album or that video coming out. It was a very important escape. And so many people for whom this book has become to mean a great deal. Back when I was in Louisville, I got a call from a woman who was doing her PhD in Indiana, and she said she had said a week prior that she was going to come and see this event. And I said, great. And then she called me the day of, and she said, my sister committed suicide yesterday. And the only thing I've been able to do is sit and read your book. And I was supposed to go to dinner with some people, the congressman from Louisville and all this kind of stuff. And instead, we sat outside, she and I, on a November night in Louisville, Kentucky. And I didn't have any false, empty comfort to offer. Only thing I could say is, I'm so sorry, and I'm here. And I thought that is what art could do broadly, could be that thing to tell that kid, I'm here with you. And also, again, from the perspective of Kendrick Lamar, I don't know a single person in the history of the world who wakes up and walks into the bathroom one day and says, oh my God, I'm a homosexual. It's never happened. I promise you, it's never happened. You see something, you meet somebody, whatever. So I thought D'Angelo was a great entry point to capture that. Because I thought what was really important was to try to bring worthy language to the beauty and challenge of loving somebody. A challenge in part because we live in a society that's very hostile to queer people, as we know. Dallas has had, which we must mention, a rash of violence and murder against black trans women that is at epidemic proportions. So this notion that we get marriage equality and then everything's hunky-dory is just not true. And we must know that. But beyond all that, there is a potential for love. And so there's a big part of the book that is a love story in some way. That starts when I was 16. Which is probably too young for love. I don't know. There's a kid here who's 17, so maybe she can tell me. And my niece is 14, and I said, she was starting high school. I said, this year you might fall in love with somebody. And she said, what? I said, it's possible. Anyway, so this is from that opening. It all started when he made me wait. Well, some of it started when he sent his first message. So, I kept that message open for a long time, though it didn't take long to read. Kept it open until the teacher walked toward my station at the back of the South Oak Cliff Computer Lab, almost in time to see his message on a dating portal that also sold pornography. I later learned that this was called synergy, a great thing that exists because two lesser things combine. I wish I had known that then. I would have said, River, we could be a synergy, baby. but I didn't know. So there was his short message and his face that resembled my mother's, at least in tone and peculiar beauty, and his eyebrows. Each brow looked like one half of an old ice block tongue made of wool. I wondered if they came naturally like that, if he came naturally like that. I wondered if this was what they called love at first sight, though now I knew it was not love. It was just the birth of my want for this boy, not to lie with him, not to speak with him, but to be the only survivor of a nuclear holocaust with him. No therapy. No one else would ever see or touch him again, and we'd both have a natural glow forever. It took only a few months of phone calls and online chats for this want to grow into, or maybe from, a need to pour myself freely and fully into something or someone, or at least into River. And the need was so great that it was as if I tried to channel all the Big Bang's noise through a single small speaker, through him. This, I understand, is not healthy for a speaker or a teenager, nor did it make much sense. But I figure we all have a person in our lives who takes up more space than good sense would allow, than we ourselves want to allow. So there they are, there he was, in the space beyond reason, where I wanted to be. This continues. You have to read the rest of the sordid details. But I hadn't planned to write about River. Again, this goes to Miss Morrison's point that you don't write what you know because you don't know nothing. But I moved to Austin in 2016, and we hadn't talked in 5 years, and he shows up and wound up being a big part of the story. And especially the ending. When he came, we went to IKEA and bought a plant. And I don't know anything about plants, so I said, well, I need some instruction or something, and I Googled and all that kind of stuff. And so I potted it and all these things, and I texted a photo of it, and I said, I sure hope this works. And he texted back, don't worry, it'll be harder to kill it than to keep it alive. This was the weekend after Thanksgiving, 2016. By New Year's Day, the plant was dead. So the ending of this story, this whole book, is inspired by that plant. And it gets to my notions of what stories are supposed to be. You think some people have great challenges with the ending of this book because they say, oh, it doesn't, what's the point? It doesn't wrap up neatly. And I said, well, does your life wrap up neatly? Okay, if we're trying to tell the truth. And more importantly, you look at the history of literature, the great stories, the endings are always new beginnings. It goes all the way back to our patron saint, Scheherazade. Here we are, 1001 Arabian Nights. And the Sultan is killing. He's marrying virgins. He's sleeping with them on the wedding night, and then he's killing them. And the executioner's daughter comes up with a plan. She says, let me marry him. And he says, no, I can't let you do that because if you do, I'll have to kill you. She says, let me try. So she marries the Sultan. They go to bed, to his bed chamber. He says, all right, let's go. She says, wait, I want to tell you a story. She says, okay, hurry up. He says, okay, hurry up. She says, if I tell you a story, you let me live. He says, you tell me a story, we'll see. So she starts to tell a story. Before she finishes the story, she starts a new story. She keeps starting stories. Before she ends the story, she starts a new story. So, if it worked for Scheherazade, my sense is I should start a new story when I am ending this one, which is why the epigraphs of this book go from Revelations, they start in Revelation and end in Genesis. And so the plant dies, and I say, I carried its brown body to the backyard and laid it down in an empty garden patch. Last time I checked, it was mixed in with the dirt. I still don't know what I did wrong, but I will try again someday. Promise. Thank you. We've got time for questions. I think there will be people in the aisles bringing microphones around. We've got one right here in the front row.
I don't really want to stand up like it was requested because you can see me. You had said you didn't really read before you were 23, and I was wondering how you got through college, especially Yale, not really reading. That's part one of the question. The second part is, what was the first thing that you read that really moved you?
I got through college. What's great, what's important, and I try to make this clear in the book, Robert Caro is a great model for me. And what's great about Robert Caro is that he never lets his personal feelings about Lyndon Johnson or Robert Moses get in the way of him doing his job, which is to tell you how the country works and to try to help you understand something about power. And the truth about Yale is that it's not really an education in learning fundamentally. It's an education in power. Did my microphone? No. All right. That was somebody from Yale saying, cut that shit off. It was cut the mic, cut the mic. Too late. Yeah, so that's the first thing. And I tried to make clear what an education in power looks like. And an education in power, as I also learned at Harvard Business School, we don't take accounting at Harvard Business School. In the first day of what would be accounting class, they say, you are not here to be accountants. You are here to hire accountants. You are here to be educated users of financial reports. So you wonder why. I used to wonder why the world was so messed up. And then I met the people who ran it. And it makes perfect sense. First thing I read that really moved me in life, or when I was 22, 23. I'm asking. Sure. Well, as I say, the Boxcar Children was very important. In Miss Davis's class, we had Drop Everything and Read. I read James and the Giant Peach. I always, my whole life, I wanted to get the hell away from wherever I was. Even when my family was fantastic in Ohio. And I was a very impossible person. You know, I got in fights with my father about whether there was gold in rocks. And he was like, I'm not arguing with you about this. Like, there's no gold in the rocks in our front yard. And I said, but there are. And one day we got in some very principled argument, and I said, you know, I was 7. And I said, listen, you have your rights, I have my rights, and I'll just have to kill myself to get some freedom around here. And I ran, and I got my Sega Genesis cord, and I started wrapping around my neck. And, you know, I mean, and he caught me. He was very fast still. And you know, so the books that really move me are books that, you know, take me away from reality. I have very little interest in reality, honestly. Yeah. Right. Can we get here?
Hello. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. The first time that I heard about you was on The Nod, which is a very different audience from this one, I think. So I'm going to ask a question.
Shade. Okay. All right.
I'm going to ask a question that I think pertains to that specific audience. I'm a huge James Baldwin fan, and he says to be black in America is to be in a perpetual state of anger. And I've found myself in spaces where I'm witnessing stories that are not, they're the stories that are underneath the rock, right? And they're not being understood because they don't understand the narrative. So for example, I was in a store and there was a young black lady talking to her young black son, and a white woman interjected talking to her son, disciplining him as if he was her child. So, of course, the young black lady interjected and said, "Please don't speak to my son or discipline him." And the white woman got upset and ran out of the store. And I felt in that moment that I also wanted to protest and walk out of the store, but I had nothing to do with the situation. So I guess, long story short, my question is, how do you handle witnessing these stories that are not being recognized?
It's a great question. I wrote in New York Magazine, which I encourage you to read. In part, it's free. You know, one of the reasons I didn't read, who's buying a book? I mean, it was like, what? And that's why I tell people on tour. I was with Marlon James, and he said, "Oh, we don't want to spoil the book." And I said, "You better tell these people what's in this book." I wasn't spending $27 on anything that I didn't know exactly what it was. So that's the only reason I keep mentioning The Black Art of Escape, because it is free and it's online and you can read it. But it was grappling with this question, and I say in that you know, I am working toward the day when to be black, to be a relatively conscious black person in this country, trying to reinterpret Mr. Baldwin's words. To be black in this country and relatively conscious is to be in a state of peace, perfect peace. That is all I am committed to. The Black Art of Escape is about reclaiming that a sense that Miss Fannie Moore's mother has, that no matter how that master treated them, no matter how her country treated them, she had a freedom on the inside that the world didn't give her and the world could not take away. So people ask me all the time, they say, "Casey, what are you working on next?" I say, "I'm working on being well." The most radical thing I can be as a black queer person in America is to be well. I have no interest in being mad about anything. So if I witness something that is disturbing, I leave. Have to, again, this is why I say my mother's example is so important. You can leave anything. You can leave your whole family. If it gets to that, I'm not encouraging it, but you can do it. You have to put that bigger value on your peace and on your inner freedom. And far too long, I wrote this essay and I wrote it to black people and nobody would publish it. They say it's too long, this doesn't make any sense. And I said, fine, I'll post it on Tumblr. I'll post it up for free. And they said, well, who's going to read it? I said, people who need to read it will read it, you see. But that's one part of it. So much of my practice is why I'm in therapy. I think all of us should be in some form of therapy. Okay. I meditate. I don't leave my house without meditating. And sometimes if all I have is 3 minutes, sometimes I'm late to interviews, I'll sit, it's alternate nostril meditation. I'll close your nostrils work as you know this, yeah? For those who don't know, your nostrils work like the pedals of a car. If you breathe, your right nostril is like an accelerant, your left nostril is a decelerant. If you close your right nostril, breathe through your left for 3 minutes, it tells your body to relax. So I left my house the other day, I went to the Apple store and I went to Target. And by the time I got back home, I was in such a rage. Seriously, I could have sliced somebody in the street. And I was just like, why am I so angry? And as soon as I got in my house, I sat down and I did my little breathing, and it was all right, you see. But I heard the CEO of General Mills last year, he said, we're really in the dirt business. I said, what does that mean? He said, if the dirt is good, everything we grow will be good. Every toxic thing in your life has to go. And you got to be very ruthless about that. The other part about the stories that are under the rock that don't appear, that's the risk you take being an artist. You know, I think if we live in a world where, Beyonce doesn't win an Emmy for Homecoming, doesn't win a Grammy for Lemonade, then what the hell do I expect for myself? What did Jesus say? If they do it to the green tree, what do they do to the brown? You see? But I think, and this is why it's so important to think about our people and to know, my grandmother used to always say, you got to know your history. Okay? Because the reality is that if Zora Neale Hurston, whose book 100 years after it was written almost came out the same year my book was written, Barracoon, which I'd encourage everybody to buy before you buy my book. Actually, no, because she doesn't need the royalties. Except buy my book, but also buy Zora Neale Hurston's book. If that book, which is so important to the whole understanding of the country, cannot be published in her lifetime, and because she would not get rid of the vernacular English in there, the publisher said, we won't publish it. If she's willing to go to her grave penniless to stand by her artistic principles, if Frederick Douglass is willing to flee the country when he releases his first book because he'll be murdered otherwise, then, you know, I get to sit here a free black person without threat of violence. I can go, worst case scenario, and get a job. You see what I'm saying? So some of it is perspective. Our people have paid such an enormous price for us to be here. And so do our work, get it to people as well as you can, and keep on living, you see.
I think we have time for just one more question.
As I read your book, I'm about halfway through, I imagine that you're talking to me. And so I imagine that you're becoming my friend. And I imagine myself age-appropriate in your life, interacting with you. And the one thing that is sticking with me over and over again is that you say at one point that you were and remain one of the best liars we will ever meet. And as a retired psychotherapist and current meditation instructor, honesty is really important to me. And so when I imagine being your friend, I think, how do you use lying today? And how has your relationship to lying changed?
Could we get one different question before? It's changed tremendously. Yeah. First of all, the context of that, I tell people all the time that the mindset of somewhat, you know, orphan, abandoned, whatever, is the mindset of a whore. I quickly learned as a kid to say and do and be whatever I thought I needed to say and do and be to get what I needed. So I saw my lives to be a life or death question, actually. So part of it has been healing from the sense that I had to say and do and be anything to live, which included also being able to provide for myself and to live on my own. So when I don't have to depend on anybody for food or shelter or anything else, and I can sit in my home except for those 2 hours I make the mistake of going to the Apple Store and Target, then I don't have to talk to nobody. So that helps with the lying, of course. But aside from that, it's work. And on all these fronts, trying to be, you know, if I'm saying that the way we're taught to live is a dead end, and what I'm trying to do is imagine what it means to truly live, to be whole, to be free, to be a better friend, a better lover, a better brother, a better sibling, to know God for real, not some worthless fear and ritual, you see. That's real work, and it starts from the position that this book is in a tradition that goes all the way back to St. Augustine and probably before, and that's the position of confession. And that does not mean in the Kardashian sense, divulging, my, boob job or something. It is saying, I really messed up and I need some help to do better, which is where my therapist and my astrologer and my Tatiana Tarot, who's great, and my numerologist Dale, without whom I don't leave the house without, and that's where I pray. And my grandfather used to say, prayer is not multiplicity of words. He was such an incredible person. He said, I could be in my automobile and just say thank you. And that's a prayer. So I try to be in constant communication with God. But it is, and I did have to, and people ask me all the time, they say, oh, how'd you square your faith with who you were? And I said, I had to let go of the God that I was given. And I had to find the God that I needed. And that took a long time, and it was real hard, and it was a dark path. But a friend of mine sent me a sermon, and we'll end on this because they want us out of here. A friend of mine sent me a sermon a few years ago by Frederick Buechner, and he said, if you want to know God, the best way to know God is to assume you know nothing about God. And that's an extraordinary starting point for me, to go on this adventure of building a relationship with this entity that's a mystery to me. That, as Thomas Merton said, to be a saint is to be yourself. And to know that if I tell the truth, that's what this thing wants me to do. And they might, I told the kids, heckle me. I mean, if you're upset or something, they might throw things at you. But you can go home. You can leave. You can be well. You deserve to have love first and foremost to yourself, for yourself. And I think, if anything else, that ending of this book is the same thing I do with lying. I still don't know why I lied, but I'll try to tell the truth someday. I promise. Thank y'all so much.